So we are in a sermon series called The First Gospel. The idea, as you guys know by now, is that God has always been good. He has always been writing good news, not just in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but starting in Genesis all the way through the entire Scripture. And through our entire lives, God is good, and He's at work for good. So we talked about the Genesis story. We covered everything from Adam and Eve to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Joseph then got us into Egypt, where we started the story of Exodus a couple weeks ago. Learned that God's people had been enslaved in Egypt, and God raised up a deliverer to bring them out, this guy named Moses. And through Moses, we talked last week, God did these crazy wonders, or these, we call them now plagues, that He brought on Egypt. But if you remember, we talked about how the plagues weren't simply God's judgment against the Egyptians, but were rather sort of a strategic assault on the gods of Egypt. That there are powers behind every imperial system. Every time there's a system of oppression or enslavement in the world, it's not simply a physical problem. It's not simply people being bad, as much as that's part of it. There are spiritual forces that oppress and enslave, and then people begin to learn how to plug into those systems. And Egypt was sort of a pawn, a tool of the powers, the gods of Egypt. And so when Yahweh brings plagues, He doesn't just bring plagues against the people of Egypt, but really attacks the powers themselves. And anybody who was aligned with them felt the consequences of that as well. We saw also that when God withdrew His hand in the plagues, that nature starts to unravel. And that the ultimate consequence of living in opposition to the goodness of God is that we're actually living in opposition to the fabric of the world. That's how God created the world, right? He created in Genesis, He said, it's all very good. So if we live in opposition to the goodness of God, we are living in opposition to the law of the universe. In the same way as if you jump off a cliff, you are now living in opposition to the law of gravity. Right? That's just because we don't see and experience moral law in the same way we do physical law doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There is a moral law that God has woven into the universe. And when we violate it, as every imperial system does, we experience the disintegration of that. A lot of times we experience that disintegration emotionally, but also physically as lives and families and emotional health and everything falls apart as a result of our opposition to who God is. So we saw that's what happens in the plagues. God withdraws His hand and everything begins to crumble. But through that act of judgment, that direct assault on the gods of Egypt, He delivered His people from slavery into a place of freedom. Now, what's crazy about that is we heard about the Passover story, the last plague of Egypt, the death of the firstborn, the most horrific and challenging for us to wrap our heads around. That then sets the paradigm for what salvation will look like as we move into the rest of the story. As an innocent sufferer whose blood is shed for us, then causes the judgment to pass by us, causes the consequences to pass over us. So God sets His people free through this remarkable, difficult, challenging act. But then he sends them on this adventure that we're going to talk about tonight. So before we get to the kind of adventurous part, I found a couple of things really interesting. We're moving quick through this story. We're not going verse by verse, and so there's a lot that we miss. So I want to mention a couple of things before we get to our text for today. When God delivered His people from slavery in Egypt, it's really fascinating. He said, I want you to go and ask the Egyptians to give you their silver and gold and clothing, and they will do that. They will be pleasantly disposed to do that for you. Really fascinating. God says, go ask them for stuff. And so as the Israelites are prepping to leave slavery in Egypt, you think that they would sort of duck out under the cover of darkness. But instead, they go to all their Egyptian neighbors and say, hey, if you've got anything laying around you don't need, could we have it? And the Egyptians say, absolutely, sure. And so they walk out of slavery in Egypt, not empty-handed, but with all of the goods of Egypt. It's almost as if Yahweh has plundered Egypt without ever swinging a sword. And His people walk out more wealthy than when they came in, which is pretty bizarre. And really interesting, when we get later in the story, God tells His people, I want you to build a tabernacle, a center for worship in the wilderness. And He says, bring whatever articles of gold and silver and clothing that you have as an offering. Where did they get that? From the Egyptians. So now God is taking the wealth of empire and repurposing it for His worship. I think that's so fascinating. The power of Yahweh in this moment. It's not just enough to get His people out of there. He wants to set them up well for a future, but a future that involves worship. Ask them for stuff and they'll give it to you. The second thing I think is really interesting is it says in Exodus, I think 14, that a mixed group left Egypt. What does that mean? Not just Hebrews. That Egyptians left Egypt with them. They had lived through the plagues. They had lived through the power of Yahweh. How could they not see that this God is greater? That this people, even though they're wandering off into nowhere, to this uncertain future, that this is where I want to be, as opposed to stuck at home. And so several Egyptians just leave. They leave Egypt and they walk out with God's people, and God welcomes them with open arms into his people, because it's never been about an ethnic group. The people of God are never, and Paul will make this argument very clearly in the New Testament, the people of God are never defined by ethnicity, but by faith, by response to who God is and what he's doing. And if an Egyptian responds, an enslaving imperial Egyptian responds to the character of God, they are welcome in the people of God. It's all about faith. And that's I think, a powerful statement for us as a community too. Anyone who is responding to the character of God in faith, even if they're just starting on a journey, even if they don't really know who he is, but they've experienced his power or his kindness or his goodness, and they take one step in faith, they are welcome in this people, in this place. This is a place where God is, and we respond in faith, and whoever responds in faith is family, because faith defines the boundaries of this family. That's how it works. Thought that was so cool. But anyway, they go from there, they leave Egypt with all the silver and gold and all this sort of stuff that they have plundered from Egypt without swinging a sword, and they head out into the wilderness. And as they're walking out into the wilderness, leaving Egypt with all this stuff, Pharaoh has a change of heart. Remember, Pharaoh is the epitome of wickedness. He is the spirit of the serpent, or the embodiment of the spirit of the serpent, the way of the dragon, the way of empire, and he has a change of heart. Actually, I don't want you to leave after all. So he sends his armies with chariots and horses and swords and spears after them to make an example of them in the wilderness. So here we have a bunch of enslaved people, a bunch of them fleeing from slavery in Egypt, now being pursued by the armies of the most powerful empire in the world. Obviously, a panic ensues. They run as far as they can go when they come up against a natural barrier. The Bible calls it the Reed Sea. Now, notice I didn't say the Red Sea. Just a point of order. Red Sea is what the King James Version of the Bible, translated in 1611, says. But in Hebrew, it says the Reed Sea. So for all these centuries, a lot of people have been saying, I know where the Red Sea is. It's that weird one that looks like a fork that's down by kind of down by Egypt, right? Well, possibly, that's possible, but scholars aren't entirely sure what Reed Sea means. So we don't know where it happened, but we know what happened. The Israelites come up across this impassable barrier, this Reed Sea, in front of them, and behind them, the armies of the most powerful empire on earth. So naturally, they start to panic. In their panic, they say something they're going to say many times over. It would have been better for us if we had just died in Egypt. We should have just gone through the plagues, because now Pharaoh's going to make an example out of us. He's going to kill us. We are in trouble. And Moses has learned something throughout this experience of leading God's people. He has learned something about the character of God, because notice what he says, and we'll get to our text in just a second. But in Exodus 14, verse 13, when the people of God are complaining, Moses says this. He answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." I love that. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. He didn't know what God was going to do at this point. He had no idea how God was going to get him out of this. God hadn't even really made it clear that he was going to deliver them from the armies of Egypt. But Moses has now experienced his character. He is taking his past, his experiences of God, his goodness and his power and his kindness, and he is bringing them into the present. The present looks dark and dismal. It's a bad situation. I mean, by any accounts, there's about to be a massive slaughter happening on this field. But Moses says, guys, we have seen how good he's been to us. We have seen how powerful he is. Do you think he's going to fail you now? Just be still And then God speaks. You know what he says? He says, okay, Moses, here's the plan. The plan is to march forward. And Moses says, wait a minute. I know that you're going to come through for us, but God, there's an ocean. There's a sea in front of us. And God says, yeah, I got that under control. Here's what I want you to do. Okay, now this is where I'd get really excited if I were Moses. Okay, you lean in, you get ready for the plan. God's going to do something crazy. He's going to send like a fireball through the enemies, or, something wild is going to happen. And God says this, Moses, I want you to hold your stick over the water. Okay, and then what's going to happen? Like lasers are going to shoot out of my stick. Like what's going to happen? And then I'll part them and you can walk through. I just love that he tells Moses the most ridiculous thing. And it's almost like he's trying to make Moses look stupid. Because when the Israelites come, okay, Moses, what's the plan? Well, you see what I'm going to do is I'm going to wade out in the water a little bit, and then I'm going to hold up my stick. And I just love that, because I think that is the picture of faith sometimes, Can you imagine being Moses in that moment, walking out into the water? He takes the staff that he's seen God do powerful things with, but he takes the staff, got the armies at his back, he's got the people all complaining, all terrified, understandably. He's got this impassable barrier in front of him, and all he can do is hold up his stick and hope that God shows up. That's faith right there. You know what faith sounds like? You know what is going on in Moses' head in that moment if I was Moses? Oh shoot. Like I hope you show up. Because otherwise I'm just standing here holding my stick in the air and I'm just going to look stupid. And honestly, the Egyptians aren't going to kill me, the Israelites are. Because that was his entire plan as a leader, was hold up the stick and trust that God's going to come through. Man, talk about convicting for somebody who wants to be a leader in a community of faith. So often our plans involve all these details, all these strategies for how we're going to grow a church, or how we're going to reach the world, or how we're going to raise money, or how we're going to find a building, or how we're going to do whatever else, how we're going to the songs we're going to sing, the passages we're going to preach, the prayers we're going to pray, the events we're going to hold, all this kind of stuff. And there's nothing wrong with any of it. But you have to understand that Moses' plan for leadership here was hold up the stick and hope that God shows up. Trust that he will. That's it. That was the early church's plan too. I heard somebody once say that 95% of what the early church did would not have happened if the Holy Spirit had left. 95% of what happened wasn't their plans, it wasn't their talents, it wasn't their vision or strategy. It was God showing up and doing through them what they could never do on their own. And so often, I think I'm convicted by being a leader in a church, so often it's almost flipped entirely, where 95% of what we do, we could do without him. Like, hey, it'd be nice if you showed up. It'd be nice if you made some people cry, or you felt the goosebumps when you're in Word. It would be nice, Lord, if you did something kind of special, but at the end of the day, we got this if you don't. Man, I want to be the kind of church where we walk in here, all of us, and we're just holding the stick up and say, man, if you don't do something, we have nothing. We are wasting our time. We are wasting our lives. We could be doing something better. But we're here holding this stick up in faith that you're going to do something, that you're going to move. I love that. God, you got to do something. Oh, shoot. And then the wind blows and the waters part. And you guys know the story. If you don't know the story, there's actual footage of it. It's called Prince of Egypt. It's perfect. It's like the perfect retelling of the whole thing. But they walk through on dry land. Pharaoh forces his armies to pursue them through this crazy scenario. The waters close back over them, and once again, God has defeated the most powerful empire on earth without ever requiring his people to do anything other than walk. Hold up the stick and go where I tell you. That's it. Powerful, it's beautiful, but it lands them in an interesting situation. Their journey in the book of Exodus is never a destination, it's always a journey. Every time they kind of pass one obstacle, there's another one to come. And I want to read to you what happens next in the story. So this is out of Exodus 16. As you've heard me say before, the most important things you're about to hear tonight are this. It's not what I have to say about this, it's what this says. So I'll read the chapter 16 in its entirety, okay? Here we go. I'll move off to the side so you can see it on the screen. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out from Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat round pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they're to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You're not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread, and then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much and some a little bit. And when they measured it out by the omer, the one who gathered too much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell, so Moses was angry with them. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow will be a Sabbath day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever's left and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," the Lord says, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You won't find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you're to go gather, but on the 7th day of the Sabbath you will not." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the Sabbath to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That's why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses says, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." So Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it, then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come." As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law that it might be preserved. The Israelites ate the manna for 40 years until they came to the land that was settled. They ate the manna until they reached the border of Canaan. And for those of you who are wondering, an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. That clarifies that? I know you're all wondering what an omer was, so now we all know. It's 1/10 of an ephah, you know? Don't ask me what that is. Okay, anyway. Here we go. Interesting story. So God sends them out into the wilderness between Egypt and Canaan, which is natural, because that's how you get to Canaan from Egypt. But they get upset in the wilderness of Canaan. And when you start to read the story, you realize that they're upset in the wilderness of Canaan for the same reason that every kid who's ever gone on a road trip is upset. which is, are we there yet? That's the question they're asking. I did a little bit of research, and I found out that if you were to walk between Cairo and Jerusalem, give or take, it would take you about 15 days if you're traveling an average of 8 hours a day walking. Now, there are a lot of people here, so let's assume it takes them twice as long. After about 30 days, you'd expect they'd be somewhere in the vicinity of the Promised Land. God is taking them from Egypt into the Promised Land. We'll give them twice the time because they've got kids and they've got elderly folks and they've got the whole 9 yards. So, okay, maybe 30 days. This is about a month after they left Egypt. That's what the date tells us. And they're still in the middle of the wilderness. And the food is running out. Okay, what I think is so interesting here is God told them when they left Egypt, ask the Egyptians for silver, ask them for gold, ask them for extra clothing. But when it came to their food, do you remember what he said? I want you to eat quickly. Don't even give time don't put leaven in the bread because you're not going to have time for the bread to rise. I want you to eat remember he says with your cloak tucked into your belt, so you're ready to walk, you're ready to go. In other words, he's concerned that they have the silver, that they have the gold, that they have the clothes, but he doesn't give them adequate provisions for the journey. They're rushing out without adequate food. And after about a month in the wilderness, their food starts to run out, and it seems like it's God's fault. Doesn't it? I mean, it seems like he has sent them out there. He should have prepared them for what was ahead. The question I have to ask is, why did God send his people into the wilderness where they would eventually stay not just for 30 days or a month, but as we all know, as we read on in the story, for 40 years without adequate provisions? Why didn't he just send them, and here's the real question, why didn't he just send them on the most expedient, quickest, most efficient route between Egypt and the Promised Land? Because that's what you'd think would happen, right? I deliver you from slavery in Egypt, and I bring you into the Promised Land, this land that he says is flowing with milk and honey, this land of abundance, this land where you will experience all of God's goodness. Instead, he says, walk into the wilderness, and when I stop, you stop. And when I go, you go. And we're just going to stay here for a while. We're going to wander around in the wilderness for a while. Why? Why not just take them directly there? And I think we get the answer to that question from their response to God's leaving them in the wilderness. Because what's their response? As soon as he brings them out here, as soon as the food runs out, now keep in mind, this is a people who has watched God rain down plagues on Egypt while sparing them, has seen his power and his goodness. They have literally just seen him part waters in front of them. He has appeared to them now by this point, we haven't even talked about yet, we will in coming weeks, as a pillar of fire to guide them through the wilderness. I mean, they're seeing the most miraculous, amazing things. Yet as soon as the food runs out, they start to say what? Let's go back. Let's go back to Egypt. Leadership lesson for anybody who wants to be in leadership, just a side note, make sure you have enough food. That's why we believe in feeding people here at Citizens. If you run out of food, things go south very quickly. But they run out of food and they say, let's go back to Egypt. Why? Here's the point, okay? Because they were still enslaved in their minds. There's a difference between liberation and freedom. Liberation can happen in a moment, and it can happen to you. Somebody else can do it to you. You can be in a position of slavery, wearing shackles, wearing all these chains, whatever else, bound up, and somebody walks into the room, and they break the chains, and they say, you are liberated, you are free, it's done. You've done nothing to earn it or deserve it, it just happens. However, depending on how long you've been in those chains, you have developed habits and ways of thinking about yourself and the world around you that don't just go away when the chains do. You walk out of that place in your mind still enslaved. Now keep in mind, the Israelites had been in Egypt for 400 years. These were 20th generation, at least, slaves. They had no idea what freedom meant. They had no idea how to live as the free people of God. All they knew was the empire. All they knew was the gods of Egypt. All they knew was slavery and oppression, this dehumanizing system. And when God delivered them from it, They weren't yet ready to live in freedom. You see, liberation can be done to you and it can be done in a moment, but freedom is something you have to learn. And it takes a while. As you unlearn patterns of thinking, as you unlearn the muscle memory of slavery and oppression, and learn a new way of being. But they don't have it yet. They're only a month out of slavery. They're only a month out of a 400-year stint as slaves. And so God takes them to the wilderness, because it's only in the wilderness that he can teach them to live free, to be the free people of God. But the second things go sideways, they say, we want to go back. They're showing us that they're still slaves in their minds. Because they've idealized slavery in Egypt. Do you hear what they said about it? They said, man, back in Egypt, you remember how great it was? We used to sit around these like giant pots of meat and just eat like these big meat buffets. Now keep in mind that Egypt, do you remember? Egypt is where they were enslaved. It's where Pharaoh told them to make more bricks with less straw. It's where he threw their babies into the Nile River. It's the guy that was ruling Egypt was the guy that had just chased them in the wilderness to annihilate them. And they're sitting there talking about the pots of meat. We should go back. Still utterly enslaved in their minds, they have idealized their slavery. They've romanticized what was happening back there. Why? Because it was certain, it was sure, it was guaranteed. At least you know what you had. You know, that's what common sense tells us, right? That's the famous saying, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. You guys heard that before? Bird in the hand is worth two in the bush means if you have a bird in your hands, and supposing you're hunting birds, if you have a bird in your hand, but you have to leave that bird behind because you think there might be two out in the bushes, you should just stick with what you know. Does that make sense? Because there's a chance you might end up with nothing. Everybody with me? You just learned a new saying tonight, didn't you? All right? Yeah, you're going to use it. Okay. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. But that's not what's happening here. That's the way we operate as human beings. I'll take the certainty of the known. Even if the known is slavery. I'll take the certainty of the known, even if the known is slavery, over the uncertainty of where God is calling me. God is calling us on an adventure of faith, and adventures are risky. They require us to put ourselves out there in ways that are difficult and challenging. So the people of Israel are standing here, hungry, on the edge of the wilderness, saying, you know what? Yeah, it was tough, but at least we knew what we had. And you can have that. You can have what you had, but you'll be enslaved. Or you can walk into the wilderness with God, and He'll set you free. And that's what happens. They're grumbling, they're complaining, crying out to God like, man, we just wish we had died in the wilderness. And you know what God says? He says, I will feed you with bread from my hand. I will provide for you in miraculous ways. But then he says to Moses, he says, have them all stand up and turn around. Because where are they right now? They're in the middle of the wilderness looking back to Egypt. He says, have them stand up and turn around. And as he was talking to them, I love this verse. It says, the glory of God appeared over the desert. The glory of God appeared over the desert. In other words, if you want to experience the glory of God, you got to go there, not there. You've got to go, as C.S. Lewis says so beautifully, you've got to go further up and further in. Into the unknown, into this adventure of faith, into this place where things don't make sense. It would be easier to go back. You can return to Egypt. You can have all measure of control over your lives. You can know what to expect in any given moment. You can have enough food. You can know what's going to happen day to day, but you will be enslaved. Or you can follow God into the desert, a crazy adventure of faith, not really sure what's going to happen from day to day. And there, He will set you free. That's what He's saying here. The wilderness is a place where God works the slavery out of us and works His freedom into us. It's where He transforms us with His presence, where He teaches us who we are. The wilderness is a place of identity. where he shows us why he saved us in the first place. He doesn't just save us so that we can do whatever we want. That's not freedom. He saves us so we can live the lives he designed us to live, and he teaches us those lives in the wilderness. He leads us to the wilderness to teach us character. Character is earned. It's found in places of lack, not in places of abundance. Why do you think the people in your life who have the most profound and the deepest character are the ones who have suffered the most? Because that's where character is formed. That's what James says, right? In the verse we all hate so much. Count it pure joy when you encounter suffering of all kinds, because the testing of your faith leads to what? Maturity. He says the testing of your faith works patience, and let patience, let this finish its work so that you may become complete, mature in Christ, lacking nothing. That happens in places of lack. That happens in places of uncertainty. That happens in the wilderness. You guys have heard me say this before, but like everybody in Christian life loves a mountaintop. We love our mountaintop moments. You can see for miles, the air is fresh and clear. It's awesome. But if you've ever been on a mountaintop, nothing grows. It's just rocks. Beautiful, but just rocks. Everything grows in the valley. Everything grows in these places, these low places. That's where God does the deep work in us. So the wilderness is essential, and most essential, because it's where he shows us who he is. Remember, just a little bit ago, these guys had no idea even who Yahweh was. When Moses walks into the Israelites and says, hey, your God says you're free. They say, who? Like, which one? Remember, 20th generation slaves, 20th generation Egyptian in their minds, have no idea even who God is. So he takes them into the wilderness to show them who he is, who they are, why they exist. And what he shows them, I love this, what he shows them, what he wants them to know, is that he's the God who feeds them with bread from his hand. That he is a God who feeds the hungry with bread from his hand. I love this. That's what he wants them to understand. He's the God of the feast. He's a God who spreads a table on the ground in front of them every day. He's a God of abundance, a God of goodness. Now, I think it's really interesting, though, how this whole feast happens. Did you guys notice that? Because there are two ways that this could have gone that it didn't go. God could have said to them, okay, I'm going to lead you through this wilderness and you're never going to get hungry. It's going to be the craziest thing. You're going to wander around in this wilderness and I'm going to keep you ever satisfied. I'm going to keep you just strong and vigorous, and everybody else around you is going to be fainting and wilting in the wilderness, looking for water and looking for food, and you're just going to be strong forever, eternally awesome in this wilderness. He could have said that. He could have done that. He could have sustained them. I mean, you'll read later that the leather of their shoes didn't even wear out for 40 years. So he sustained their shoes. You suppose he could have done the same for them? Absolutely. But he doesn't. Why? Because then what use would they be to anybody? God never, and this is tough for me, but God never isolates his people from the hard things of the world. He never insulates them against the difficulties and the challenges of life around them. And sometimes that's what people will sell Christianity to you as. If you believe in God, everything's going to work out. He's going to take care of everything, you know? If you just have enough faith, you won't get sick. You won't experience, financial troubles. You won't go through hardships. But that's just nonsense. God's people in Scripture always experience the stuff that the people around them are experiencing. Why? So they can be useful. Honestly, what good would we be as a people of God if we had no empathy, no understanding, no wisdom, no compassion for people who are suffering? If we said, God is so good, look at how blessed we are, and they say, well, that's nice for you, but you've never had to walk a mile in my shoes. Honestly, what good would the people of God be in a suffering world if we've never experienced suffering? If we've never experienced loss, how could we comfort people in loss? God doesn't want this people who wander through a wilderness ever green, ever strong. They're going to experience what other people experience in the wilderness. So they can help them walk through it. Because everybody, at some point, by the goodness of God, will come to the wilderness. He leads us there to set us free. But He also wants people around us that can help us through it, that have been there, who've walked the road before, and understand how it works. And what good would we be if we never experienced it? But notice what He also doesn't do. So on one hand, He doesn't enable them. He doesn't just make things easy for them. But on the other hand, He doesn't do what you would expect, which is, teach a man to fish, right? What you'd expect Him to do would be like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you how to survive in the wilderness. There's all sorts of plants out there that if you learn how to forage for them, you could probably eat. And there's game running around in the wilderness that I could teach you to hunt. And there are ways of collecting dew or rainwater or cutting the roots off of plants and squeezing the moisture out of them. There are ways to survive in the wilderness. And God could have said, I will Bear Grylls this whole thing. I will teach you how to survive on nothing in the wilderness. But He doesn't. Why? 2 reasons. 1, that would create an independently strong people. And independence is never God's goal. God does not want His people to be independent. And I know that's a hard thing to say in a place where we pride ourselves on independence. That is a virtue in this country, and there's nothing wrong with it at that level, okay? But on a spiritual level, on a life with Jesus level, independence is not a virtue. It's a challenge to be overcome. We all think that we have it, we understand the way that life is supposed to work and how to live and who we are. When God comes in, He says, dear one, you don't have a clue. I designed you. Let me teach you how I made you. Let me teach you what life is supposed to look like. In other words, learn from me. Be dependent upon me. That's a virtue in Scripture. Dependence on the Spirit. It's like Moses with a stick up, right? Fully dependent on God to show up. Fully dependent. If you don't show up, I'm lost. If you don't show up, we're lost. Moses in that moment is a picture of dependence. God is not looking to make an independent people. And second reason I think He didn't just teach them how to survive in the wilderness. They weren't supposed to live in the wilderness forever. That wasn't their final destination. He had promised them a home in a land flowing with milk and honey. And in that place, they were supposed to be a city on a hill, a light to the nations, that everybody could look to, everybody wandering in the wilderness could look to and say, I see home. I heard a pastor recently say, when you read the Genesis story, Genesis 1 and 2, God didn't create any deserts. I don't know what to think of that, but it's true. Creates a garden and trees and water and all these beautiful things, and that's where He puts His people in the middle of this lush paradise, not in a dry and arid place for them to figure out how to survive. God doesn't intend for us to live in the wilderness. Sometimes He leads us through it so He can teach us who He is and who we are and how to be free. But He doesn't want us to stay there. He wants us to come out the other side, free and alive, and experiencing His abundance and goodness so that we can give it to everybody else. If He taught them how to survive in the wilderness, then the story would have been different. They would have become this really hardy, survivalist wilderness people that people would come to from all over to learn how to survive in a wilderness setting, but that's not what He intends for us. Read the book of Revelation. He's leading us to a garden city with rivers and trees and fruit and everything good. We don't stay in the wilderness forever. He brings us home. So instead, I love what He does. Instead of just making it so they don't have to eat, or instead of teaching them how to survive, He walks this middle road where He says, I'm going to feed you, but you're going to have to go out and get it. I'm going to feed you, but you're going to have to go get it. Notice that? He says, first, I'm going to feed you with food from my hand. You're going to walk out every morning and there's just going to be food on the ground. Again, the Lord of the feast. I'm going to spread a banquet in front of you every single day. And it's not going to be because of anything you've done. As a matter of fact, notice that they grumble and complain, and then they come out the next day and there's food again. They do what God tells them not to do, they come out the next day, there's food again. It's not because of you, it's because of me. It's my grace that is spreading this banquet table in front of you every single day. You didn't work for it, you didn't earn it, you didn't deserve it, you didn't manufacture it, you didn't hunt it. It just was there because He's the God of the feast. And that's what He wants them to know, because why? He's going to send them into a land flowing with milk and honey. And what do you think He wants them to do with that when they get there? Spread out a table. Make a feast for the nations. Make a feast for the lost and the hurting. That's how Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven over and over again, is this wedding party, this banquet. And so He teaches them in the wilderness, this is who I am. I'm a God who feeds the hungry. Just because of grace, not because of earning or deserving, but just because it's who I am. Just out of love, I spread a feast on the ground. So when the hungry come into your lives, when you have entered into His abundance, what do? Same thing He did. Not because they earn it, not because they deserve it, not because they're worthy, but because of who He is. You spread a feast. So He feeds them in grace and in love. But then He tells them, go out and get it. Now, go out and collect it every single day. In other words, they have to participate with Him in this process. He doesn't just stick the food in their stomachs. He doesn't just stick a jar in everybody's house every day. He doesn't put it on the tables. He says, go out and get it. He's not looking for spoiled children. He's looking for adults who participate with Him, who partner with Him, who walk with Him, who are willing to go out and get the provision that He has given us. I mean, let's think of this in practical terms. Look what God has given us in His grace. He has given us the story of who He is and what He's doing in the world. And I don't say this to shame anybody, because I've been here in my life too, but if stats are to be believed, 70% of Christians don't even open this book. Christians. That's hard, isn't it? When He's laid out a feast in front of us, but we don't go out and get it. It says His mercies are new every morning. But sometimes I just step into my day without even paying attention to His presence or His goodness. I'm not going out and getting the mercy that He's laid in front of me. It says when two or more gather in His name, there He is. But sometimes we don't gather. We're not going out and getting the provision. He's provided community. He's provided so many good gifts. But He's not just going to throw it at us. He's not just going to force it upon us. He's going to say, go get it. Go get the blessing, the provision that I've given you. You have to look for it. You have to work for it. You have to obey. You have to do what He says. Notice He's got very specific instructions here. He says, go out and get just enough for you and your household. And of course, the Israelites, what do? They go out, and some people have like big hands and some people have small hands. Some people are old and can't move very fast, and some people are young and limber and they can collect a lot more. And so they have these people gathering a whole bunch and these people gathering a whole little, and when they take it back, God says, no, I told you just enough for you. So He redistributes everything. I love that. When they count it out, there's a bunch who gathered too much and a bunch who gathered too little, but when they measure it out, they all have exactly enough. Because God here is showing you that, look, I have a way of doing this that I expect you to follow. It's called obedience. And there's a reason for that. It's because God doesn't want to set up another system of slavery like Egypt, right? Because if it was all about who could gather the most, then you make a competition out of it. And you have somebody who's really strong and really fast and really efficient, and they gather a whole bunch, and then they stockpile it, and then they start selling it to the people who only got a little bit. You know, it's capitalism. It's slavery. They would just recreate Egypt. But God says, no. You gather enough, and I'm going to make sure that everybody just gets enough so that everybody is taken care of. So there is no permanent lower class among my people. There are no haves and have-nots. And if you think you're going to stockpile it overnight, the next morning it'll be rotting. It'll be filled with maggots. This is how good He is. You want to make sure that every single person, from the smallest to the greatest, from the most clever to the least clever, from the oldest to the youngest, that every single one of them gets to eat enough. And so he says, go out and gather it in the way that I tell you to. Obey, participate, do what I tell you to do. I love what he says about the Sabbath, though. He says, except on the Sabbath. On the day before Sabbath, gather for 2 days. Now, if I were them, I would say, wait. I know it's going to happen tomorrow. It's going to be rotting. What do you mean gather for 2 days? But he says, no, I'm going to sustain it. That one day, because I want you to rest. Because I want you to be a real human being. And the only way you can be a real human being is if you rest. If you rest in my presence. If you take my Sabbath. I am going to miraculously provide. I'm going to miraculously store the food overnight, just that one day, so you don't have to go out the next day and work for it. We're going to talk more about Sabbath as we go. This is really important in the book of Exodus especially, because back in Egypt, it was all about work harder and more efficiently. And that defines your worth. Pharaoh says, more bricks, less straw, you're lazy, work harder, work harder, work harder. He grinds them into the ground. And when Yahweh sets them free, he wants them to know that they are first and foremost not human doings, but human beings. That their worth is not built up in what they produce, but in who he has made them to be. So he says, 1 day a week, rest. Rest, and that rest will rehumanize you. It will sustain you, and I will sustain you on it. You would think that 1 extra day of work would mean 1 extra day of income. And that if we don't work, that the world is going to fall apart. But he says, look, that 1 day, you don't work, and I'll take care of it. I love that. Every day you go out, you gather food. And you gather it for that day. You receive food for that day, and you have to do the work that day. But on this 1 day, you don't gather it, and I'll take care of everything. What if we believe that? I mean, what if we believe that that was how God was when he asks us for stuff, when he gives us stuff, you know? Does that make any sense? Like, what if we believe that when God asks us to give generously to him of our time and our resource, that he will always give back? When he says, look, you work for 6 days, and then you take it off and trust that I'm going to provide for you. Trust that I will care for you. Trust that I will sustain you. That it's not your work that makes the world go around, but it's my hand. So he says, go out and do it in my way. Obey, follow my way, and you'll eat food from my hand. He's looking for this partnership here. Go out and get it. I'll provide it. You do the work to go out and get it. And then trust that if you do it my way, I'll sustain you. And for 40 years, they eat bread from his hand. And they learn obedience. They learn partnership and participation. They learn reliance and trust. They learn who God is through that season. And that's the whole point. That's the whole point of the story. That's what he's doing in the wilderness. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff that's going to happen out there. They're going to go to Mount Sinai. He's going to teach them his laws. They're going to build a tabernacle. They're going to have all these crazy experiences. But I think this story comes first. This is the first wilderness story because it sets the stage for everything. Why has he led us to the wilderness? So he can teach us to partner with him in the feast he is providing for us. So he can teach us reliance and obedience. He can teach us trust and faith. That's why he's brought us to this place. You know, at the end of the wilderness stories in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses will reflect back over his time. He'll reflect back on the wilderness and he'll say, you know, God gave us the manna in the wilderness so he could teach us what? Remember, Jesus quoted it. So he could teach us that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. In other words, he came to teach us who he is. He brought us out there to teach us reliance and trust, to teach us partnership and obedience, to teach us who we are and who he is. I'm not going to live there forever, but God is at work in the wilderness. If you find yourself in a wilderness season right now, I just want to be clear. Back is not the way. Going back to what worked before is not the way. The ways of empire, of slavery, of the serpent, they're not the way. They're not going to get it done. Coping mechanisms aren't going to get it done. Oftentimes, when God leads us to the edge of the wilderness, he will appear farther out. He'll say, you know what? I know you don't want to. I know it's going to be hard and challenging, but follow me into this place, and I'll show you who I am. I'll show you my glory. I'll show you a new way of thinking, a new way of being. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be safe. But you'll eat bread from my hand. And one day, I'll bring you through it to a land flowing with milk and honey.